Good morning for those of you who are in the Eastern time zone. And I'm not sure where the online audience is, but welcome. My name is Pamela Nadell. I am a professor of Jewish history here at American University. And I am a historian, so I'm not somebody who typically works in this space. I will just give you a sense of the format. I've been asked to make a few minutes of opening remarks. But before I do that, I very much want to introduce just briefly the members of the panel, but I will read their full biographies before each person speaks. So Mark Weitzman, who is to my right, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization, Mallory Knodel from the Social Web Foundation, and Andre Obler, who has just joined me again on my left, who works at Online Hate Prevention Institute, and Paul Giannasi, who is a National Police Hate Crime Advisor from the UK. And I'm here today because I work on the history of American anti-Semitism. I'm completing a book called Anti-Semitism and American Tradition, a history which will be published next year. And what I'd like to do in the few minutes of opening remarks that I've been asked to make is I actually would like to locate this moment in time in a broad historical perspective. And what I mean by that is that new technologies have become the way in which anti-Semitic myths, conspiracy theories have spread since the early modern period. And I think most of the people on the panel with me won't be familiar with this, but those of you who are aware of the blood libel, the notion that Jews murder Christians in order to use their blood for ritual purposes, that the first blood libel occurred in England in 1144, and it only spread in essentially monastic circles and in local communities. But it was the invention of the printing press in the 15th century that enabled the notion of the blood libel to spread. And in particular, the case of Simon of Trent in 1475. A little boy was found murdered in Trent in Italy in 1475. It was that story, the way it percolated thanks to the printing press, that really enabled the blood libel to take off. And of course, the blood libel remains a powerful myth and conspiracy idea today, certainly in media as well. But then if we jump to the 20th century and we talk about Henry Ford, in May of 1920, Henry Ford owned a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and it started a 91-week series called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. And in that series, Ford published, as part of that series, he published sections of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which had been written originally in Russia in 1903. It came to the United States after World War I. In the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, it got translated in the United States, actually got translated in military circles. And now then Ford's sending it out thanks to the rise of mass circulation newspapers. Publishing that series sent Ford's newspaper to become the second highest circulation newspaper in the United States. What was more dangerous was that that all of those columns were eventually put into 4 volumes, and because they were never copyrighted, they remained widely in circulation down until today. You can read all of them if you go to Wikisource, I believe, and of course they were translated into multiple languages. So jump just one decade ahead, Father Charles Coughlin, known as the radio priest in the United States in the 1930s, uses the radio to disseminate his hate speech. Who did he hate? He hated Jews and he hated communists. And Even though he was a Catholic priest, and Catholics are a minority in the United States, it's estimated that 1/4 of Americans listen to his radio broadcasts from Royal Oak, which is just outside of Detroit. In the wake of the massive pogrom against Jews in November 1938 in Nazi Germany, he blamed the Jews for the pogrom. So the printing press, mass circulation newspapers, the radio became forums for accelerating the spread of hate speech. And as we know from our colleagues who are on the panel today and from the purpose of this conference, we know that in the end of the 20th century and the 21st century, what became the venue for accelerating hate speech has been the online forum. And not only that, it enables individuals like those who gathered at the Unite the Right rally in August 2017 in Charlottesville, enables them to find each other. It enabled a shooter at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, who murdered 11 people at worship, to post what he thought. And it enabled the man who massacred people at the mosque in Christchurch to film what he was doing. It enabled the Hamas invaders of Israel on October 7th, a year ago, to film what they were doing and to broadcast it to the world. So with that, the closing remarks.
Recording in progress.
Well, we're a little late. Those opening remarks, those 5 minutes of remarks, I'm going to turn to Mark Weitzman. I'm going to introduce him and give him the opportunity to make his remarks. But let me introduce Mark first. Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization. Previously, he was Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and also Chief Representative to the United Nations in New York. He's a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, better known as IRA. We're going to hear more about that. And he previously chaired its Committee on Antisemitism and Holocaust Denial. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you, Andre and Murdy, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate, especially following in Pamela Nadell's, words, following up on her words, because she, first of all, anticipated some of the remarks that I'm going to make. But more than that, I know that she's working on a book about American anti-Semitism, and I really want to recommend it to everybody when it comes out, because I have a feeling it's going to be really an eye-opener for many of us who do not really know the roots of anti-Semitism in America and the impact that it has both previously and in the present. To begin with, I want to begin with referring to two articles in last week that came out in news media sources. One was the New York Times, one the Voice of America. The New York Times story read, and quoting the headline, "Anti-Semitism and threats directed at officials over storm response. X platform has been one of the main drivers of disinformation." And at the same time, another headline, quote, "China connected Spamophage networks spread anti-Semitic disinformation," end quote. Think about this for a minute. Two stories that have nothing to do with Israel, Zionism, the Middle East, or any of the hot-button controversies that we're dealing with, and yet these two anti-Semitic posts have garnered, according to estimates, approximately 20 million viewers on the platforms that they came out. And none of them had to do with the current forms of anti-Semitism that we imagine. My teacher, the late scholar of anti-Semitism, Robert Chazen, once wrote, I'm quoting again, "Every new stage in the evolution of anti-Jewish thinking is marked by a dialectical interplay between a prior legacy of negative stereotypes and the realities of a new social context," end quote. I would add to Chazen's formulation that it's not only a new social context, but also, as Pamela mentioned, technological innovation that encourages anti-Semitism. Pamela referred to Magda Teeter in her important book, Blood Libel. Nor did the spread of the blood libel was accentuated by the invention of the printing press. You already heard about Henry Ford and Charles Coughlin, but I'm going to add as well that in the prelude of the Holocaust, the run-up to the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler and his propaganda master Joseph Goebbels used radio as a tool to reach into every German home. Leni Riefenstahl, the famous director, produced documentaries that valorized Hitler and the Nazis, and Hitler was also credited with being the first politician to use airplanes for his campaigns. So in this regard, the internet is no different from early forms of technological innovation, and that anti-Semitism has been present online since its earliest days. In a history of online anti-Semitism that I published a little while ago, I noted that the origins of anti-Semitism in cyberspace can be traced back as far as the early BBS systems of 1983 and 1984. What is new, of course, is the vastly enhanced reach of the anti-Semitic message and the increased challenge posed by social media and now AI, which undermines our understanding of reality and historical fact. So how do we deal with this challenge? To begin with, we look into our toolbox and see what's available. And in this case, there are a variety of possible tools, but one of the most potent tools is using public policy to help create safeguards. And of course, there are precedents for this. Another technological innovation, let's say the automobile, has required new public actions, such as speed limits, seatbelts, licensing drivers, traffic lights, and even regulations regarding loud mufflers to ensure the maximum safety and comfort for the population, both users and non-users, while allowing for the most favorable use of the technology. One attempt to use public policy to counter anti-Semitism is the IRA's non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And full disclosure here, I introduced and spearheaded IRA's adoption of the definition, so I'm personally well acquainted with it. I'm aware of some of the controversy around the definition and will respond to that later in my remarks. The IRA's definition is an example of an attempt to combat anti-Semitic hate speech by implementing public policy based on expert opinion. IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is an intergovernmental organization that was created in 2000 as the International Task Force on the Holocaust, with a mandate focused on addressing contemporary challenges related to the Holocaust. It consists of 35 member countries, 31 at the time of the adoption of the definition, with an annual rotating presidency. The national delegations are made up of diplomats, scholars, museums and memorial professionals, educators, and representatives. IRA's decisions are by consensus, meaning that all its member countries must agree, and they take place at one of the biannual plenary sessions. I introduced the definition to IRA in 2014, and 3 years later it was adopted in the Toronto plenary of 2016. During that period, the definition went through a process of review and discussion and some editing by all the diverse members of the national delegations, their governments, and anyone else they chose to consult. In other words, it was adopted in a thoroughly open and transparent manner. The premise of the definition was to have a baseline understanding of anti-Semitism for IRA's professionally diverse and multinational membership. It is conceived of as a legally non-binding resource with educational, moral, and political value. The definition absolutely does not call for prescribed speech and does not seek to protect any group or country from reasonable criticism. It does note that some countries criminalize anti-Semitic expressions, but it does not call in any way for criminalization itself. The examples aim to provide glimpses of the forms that anti-Semitism might take, but they certainly do not represent a rigid taxonomy of anti-Semitism. There's a body of text that followed by 11 different examples. The definition does not refer to anti-Semitic people, only to anti-Semitic actions, and it specifically avers that in defining anti-Semitism, context matters. Essentially, it presents an internationally accepted baseline that can allow us to recognize and shine a light on current forms of anti-Semitism. Once we have identified the issue, then we can suggest an appropriate remedy, something the definition does not presume to do. Simply put, it brings practical clarity to a confusing social problem. This is precisely the process as described in the U.S. National Standards of Fighting Anti-Semitism, which states that, and quote again, in order to combat and counter anti-Semitism, Americans must recognize and understand it. Far too many do not. There are several definitions of anti-Semitism which serve as valuable tools to raise awareness and increase understanding of anti-Semitism. The most prominent is the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, adopted in 2016 by the 31 member states of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which the United States has embraced, end quote. So according to the national strategy, first comes the definition, and then the proposed actions or remedies. Critics of IRA generally fall into two categories. One category are generally lawyers or academics who are well-intentioned, but insist on applying the standards of academia and fault the definition for lacking a certain specificity or rigor. To this, I will only point out that IRA bills itself as a working definition. In this case, it refers not to a work in progress, but a text that is meant to be applied in a working situation. IRA is not a philosophical or academic text meant for discussion in seminar rooms. It is a practical text meant to help non-experts, such as police, educators, politicians, officials, media, and even tech professionals who are confronted with a situation and must make a determination on whether that situation could be described as anti-Semitic, and do not have the background or training to do so. IRA then becomes the tool to help in that evaluation and to make the assessment policy. IRA by itself does not prescribe punishment, but it does demand accountability. Or as I wrote previously with Robert Williams of the USC Shoah Foundation, IRA, quote, does not define who is an anti-Semite. Instead, it says there are certain manifestations of anti-Semitism. This focus on forms allows for dialogue, that is, conversation about conscious or unconscious expressions of anti-Semitism, which in turn can lead to real and lasting change, end quote. There is, however, another category of critic, those who challenge IRA precisely because it dares to name the hatred of Jews that is couched in anti-Zionism. These bad faith actors simply do not want anyone shining a light on how their obsessive hatred of Israel is linked to their anti-Semitism. By harassing, threatening, and targeting Jews, whether in Israel or abroad, by refusing to acknowledge any legitimacy to Jewish national existence, by engaging in acts of terrorism and then denying that those very same acts ever took place, or by legitimizing the butchery and rape of women and children, by using social media as part of this campaign, and then claiming that IRA is a tool of Zionist censorship when it is used to illustrate this anti-Semitism, these propagandists are attempting to counter what they feel is one of the most potent tools that can be brought to bear against them. Finally, I must address one other claim that has been put forward. Kenneth Stern has described himself, again quoting, as the author of the IRA definition, is often the forefront of this criticism, and his stature as the supposed author of IRA is used to legitimize many attacks. The problem is that any such claim of Stern's authorship is simply false. The IRA definition grew out of an earlier attempted definition by the European Union Monetary Center, the human rights arm of the European Union. Stern was part of the original drafting group, and here I'm going to quote from an open letter written by other drafters. Quote, this group includes our colleague at the time, Kenneth Stern, who has since identified himself, or is described by others, as the author or primary drafter of the working definition. This is simply not true, but most troubling is the fact that this mythical, elevated status is primarily touted because he is a vocal critic of using the working definition, and thus a helpful, witting or unwitting, ally for those today who seek to discredit the IRA working definition. Virtually all others who were involved in its development believe then and continue to believe now that the adoption and use of the working definition is an essential component in the fight against anti-Semitism, end quote. And I can add from my own experiences being involved with IRA from its very origins until today that Stern never was involved with IRA, and I never had any conversation with him about the definition while it was being adopted. In other words, anything he claims about the process of IRA's adoption or intent is simply without basis and should not be relied upon. It is, however, true that IRA, like the auto, can be used in ways that are challenging or unanticipated. When I introduced IRA, it was conceived of as an internal text, meant to help the delegates in their work. However, upon adoption, it took on a life of its own, and it clearly outgrew that original conception. Clearly, it was felt in many quarters that IRA spoke to a need and it was a timely message. In this regard, it resembles any other text an author offers to the public that opens itself up to different interpretation or unanticipated uses. Indeed, to use the phrase appropriate to this conference's theme, IRA has gone viral over the past few years. And of course, there were those who immediately saw IRA as a potent political tool to be wielded against those they either disagreed with or just wanted to oppose on general political grounds. At times, some who have claimed to embrace IRA have actually defended or sat down with anti-Semites to further their own policies or politics. IRA, precisely because it does not punish, because it recognizes nuance and context, because it encourages responsible speech and debate, is fundamentally a tool of liberal democracy. And that's why it should be no surprise that enemies of liberal democracy are some of the most strident critics of IRA. Those Chinese spamophage networks mentioned earlier, according to the news report, these types of anti-Semitic postings, quote, abounded after the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill requiring the Department of Education to formally adopt IRA. It should also be no surprise that technology, some of the most significant platforms, where the giants like X or low-profile ones like Twitch or Rumble, counter criticism by crying censorship. What can we do when Twitch honors as a, quote, legendary woman, and, quote, someone who celebrated the October 7th massacre? How do we react when Rumble and X stream portions of last June's Jewish Problem Conference that was held in Kentucky and featured a smorgasbord of anti-Semites, including white supremacists, black nationalists, and far-right extremists, some for the notorious Goyim Defense League? IRA is needed precisely because our times demand practical tools to deal with anti-Semitism. To close, I want to recall the words of the great historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who was commenting on a paper given by a radical Christian theologian at a symposium held in June 1974, reflecting on the impact of the Holocaust. Yerushalmi wrote, and I'm quoting, historically, reformist tendencies and movements have not necessarily led to a positive revaluation of Jews. Indeed, they have often been accompanied by a more virulent anti-Semitism. For my people, now as in the past, is in grave peril for its life, and I simply cannot wait until you have completed a new Summa Theologica, end quote. If Yerushalmi could write that 50 years ago, what would he say today, at almost 80 years after the liberation of Auschwitz? What are we going to do about it? For the danger is only metastasized, and we are desperately in need of remedies and the courage to apply them. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me ask. In our format, I'm going to get a chance to ask a first question, and so let me ask the question that always comes up when we talk about this issue, which is that, and especially since we're sitting on a college campus, is how is using this definition, which I hear is often used incorrectly, it's not meant to be used in this way, but the argument is always that it's going to curtail free speech and diminish civil rights. Do you have a quick response to that?
Sure. First of all, I think that people need to look at the definition exactly as it pulls itself. It is a legally non-binding, meaning that there is no intent to have legal remedies applied through the definition. The idea of the definition was to help, as I said, create a basic sort of baseline understanding of what anti-Semitism is to be applied in a practical sense. Once something is viewed as anti-Semitic, the definition's job, or not viewed as anti-Semitic, by the way, it could cut both ways. The definition's job is essentially finished there. Then one can go into applying the proper remedies. Remedies can vary. Remedies can be legal, they can be educational, they can be political. There is no one, one for all in a sense there. One fits all there. So the definition's job is really to begin to help people who are not experts in anti-Semitism, in history, in Jewish history, in Holocaust studies, whatever you will, have an understanding when they're confronted with something. When we're on a campus, if there is vandalism on a campus, if there is a mob that is shutting down a campus, etc., if there are slogans on that campus being used, are those anti-Semitic? Are those not anti-Semitic? If they're anti-Semitic, whether it's on the campus, it may fall under certain hate speech provisions on campus, or the Department of Education has certain enhanced penalties for things that assault certain protected categories of people, including now Jews. Then that situation may apply. If it's not anti-Semitic, a whole different situation applies there. So the definition is really a preliminary tool that has a very specific role and function. And in some ways, it's more of an educational tool than anything else. I will also say that, when it's compared to fears of McCarthyism, of encroaching the episodes of Joseph McCarthy is one of the most shameful in American history. It really, rocked the foundations of American democracy in many ways, ruined people's lives. But McCarthyism never had to deal with mobs that are going out and physically harassing Jewish students or attacking Jews on the streets and so on. McCarthyism is a very different animal, and we need to be very careful about anything that takes us down that path again, which would be a disaster. We need to protect the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of expressing opinion, which is why one of the reasons why I like IRA is that, as we said, it could encourage dialogue. It could encourage accountability. If you, as a person, are accused of saying something anti-Semitic, it doesn't say, first of all, that you are anti-Semitic. It said the statement is. Defend the statement. Maybe the other part is wrong. That's where context matters as well. Maybe the accusation falls apart. Maybe if it's accurate, you can begin to reassess. There could be a dialogue on why you said that and what exactly you said and what it means and how it's harmful and hurtful. I just combined two words there. And IRA opens the door for those possibilities when it's properly applied.
I'm so glad you used the word context. It's become such a negative word in the academic world since last December. So thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Mallory Knodel. Mallory Knodel from the Social Web Foundation is a public interest technology and human rights expert specializing in internet governance and digital policy. She's actively involved in global internet governance processes, including at the IETF, the IEE, and the UN. Her background in computer science and civil society brings a unique perspective to the intersection of technology, policy, and human rights. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate the IEEE for hosting this conference at all. I think it's really important that as technologists or people working on technology that we consider human rights, social justice, other ethics, and other frameworks. It's very much part of my work for the last 15 plus years to do just that. So I spend my time in the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IEEE, like all of you, and in other standards bodies like the World Wide Web Foundation, the International Telecommunication Union. And I come at this, yes, as you mentioned, a technologist, but I've always worked for nonprofit organizations. So I once was the head of digital for Article 19, which is the largest free expression organization in the world based in the UK. Just previously, I was at the Center for Democracy and Technology here in Washington, D.C. as their chief technologist. And now I've founded a new organization with my colleagues, Evan Perdomo and Tom Coates, called the Social Web Foundation. So we are really interested now in looking at how some of these harms that we're talking about today, but many, many other issues as they play out in the public square. Today's public square is very much on social media. Those typically are private spaces, and I'll get to how that fits into the remedies in a while. And the Social Web Foundation is looking at how those can be more decentralized and not controlled by any one company through the use of protocols. So this would be if folks have ever heard of Mastodon or of Threads is a meta product that also uses this protocol. So that's sort of a little bit about me. I'm going to start by coming at this from the free expression perspective. So having worked at Article 19, I think it's really important also, like Mark, to start with definitions. But in fact, international human rights law accepts that it isn't really possible to create a definition for hate speech. So instead, what it has done is it creates a framework based on severity of harms in order to prescribe remedy for the effects of hate speech. So again, I'm not working from a definition, but I can give you the framework in broad strokes. Imagine in your mind a pyramid, and at the bottom, you'll find a lot more of the kinds of content. Towards the top is the more extremist content and also where the greater harm exists. So the severity of harm framework says that speech is protected in a lot of surprising cases, which I'll get to in a moment. Then there's another sort of middle ground where it may be restricted, such as in cases of national security or where it infringes on others' rights. Remember that the international human rights framework is really about the sort of discussion around how rights may be impacting one another, where it becomes very much a matter of concern. So I would say, a freedom of expression expert is actually more of an expert in hate speech than anything else, simply because when the rights conflict, and several of the rights in the human rights framework conflict, that's when the lawyers get involved and that's when the nuance comes in. Other cases where beyond those, then you have, of course, what is restricted in IHRL, and that would be calls to genocide, for example. It's very, very specific, and the bar is very high. So we also know, and of course, understand, right, that from any context, if it's Rohingya genocide, if it's what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza and Israel, the hate speech problem is very complex. And the way that the human rights framework is written is it doesn't worry about the substance of the speech. It is worrying about the harms. So it doesn't specifically call out. We know that race is a factor, gender can be a factor, several national and ethnicities are factors. The human rights framework doesn't speak to any of those specifically. For something to be restricted, so this is at the top of the pyramid, this is the most extreme harms, it must pass a three-part test in order to be restricted. And that three-part test is it must be provisioned in law, so there must be a law that somehow prohibits or restricts. It must be a legitimate restriction, meaning that the restriction is because of the harms and not because of something else, like blasphemy against the king or something. So it must be a legitimate use of that law. And the last thing is it must be democratic in the sense that the outcome of the restriction results in more democratic outcomes, right? So that's a three-part test. So here's where we get to things that aren't. This is always sort of a fun exercise. I think most people would be quite surprised about what's on this list. In fact, I was sort of considering doing a hand-raising activity with you all, but I will spare you that. So things that are not restricted or that should not be restricted, something that is offensive, should not be restricted by law. Blasphemy, we've already sort of talked about that. Defamation is similar. Denial of historic events, that is not to be restricted in IHRL. State protection, even. So doing something from national security is in that gray area, may be restricted, but again, it must pass the three-part test. And then the last thing, which is another complicated one for most folks, is discussion of terrorist acts. And that is mostly complicated and in this gray area because the definition itself of what would constitute terrorism is not well defined and often very much part of the identifying harms. So what does this look like online? So let me switch now from just a pure human rights framework to talking about the reality of our online world today. So as a technologist, I can't leave this out. I think it's really important for us to understand. So far, what has been said is that the scale and the virality of the online spaces are part of this problem. And I think that often implies or sometimes does spark imagination that then the online realm can also solve it or must also take steps to fixing the problem. And I think it's important to be realistic about what that actually looks like. I will say that what I just finished discussing in terms of the shouldn't be restricted, may be restricted, and should be restricted, that is a lawful interpretation. Now, any private online space, and I've sort of already admitted to you all that I find most social media companies to be essentially private public spheres, they do have their own norms. They are able to create their own policies however they'd like, and they sort of can slide between, not restricted to restricted depending on how they want to do business, or maybe the countries in which they're doing business, even though a lot of the ones that we are imagining right now are very much multinationals. But it is actually in the human rights framework, states that are the ones who are restricted from these things in the framework, and it is companies and maybe other people or institutions that only have responsibilities. And so their actions should be voluntary. It could be that states impose obligations on companies within their jurisdiction to follow certain laws, like that's certainly lawful. But other than that, it is very much the private companies that do that. And that is presents a massive problem, frankly. So having worked for these same organizations I've worked for that are very concerned about free speech, they are also very, very concerned about harms. And it has been very difficult for the last 15 years. It's getting better with trust and safety teams now in most of these large companies to get the companies to understand real harms that are being seen by communities where the harms are actually happening and to have them do something about it. So mostly this has been a failure of those companies to take the necessary voluntary steps. And I think it's also a failure of us imagining that all platforms, because they're multinational, because they're so large with so many people on them, should have one-size-fits-all policies. That's really challenging when you imagine different contexts and jurisdictions have different relationships to these problems, right? So that's something that we hope with more decentralized social media or more collaborative, transparent, accountable private platforms that will improve over time. We've talked about context, but you can imagine how context then fits into this very much so. I also think that there are many ways to go beyond just policy. We imagine in a lot of the social media contexts that the action or the intervention is to take something down. So if something has been reported by a user, which is actually very effective, user reporting is very effective, that then that content is just deleted. But that isn't the only thing that can happen. Obviously, if there's a lot of inauthentic behavior, meaning that the user themselves or itself, if it's a bot, right, is not actually a person. They're not actually exercising speech. They are trying to post online a volume of different content, and that often is something that will violate a platform's policies. So you could take the user account offline, for example, not just the content. Sometimes, I'm sure maybe Paul will get to this later, that these things are held onto for the purposes of reporting them to the police and to help with investigations. That's another thing that we forget, is there's actually a danger sometimes in just removing content, right? Because that can be actually very useful. Other interventions have been where trusted sources of content, especially where it's a publication, right? Those kinds of trust frameworks are implemented, and they can be reinforced and supported by platforms by choosing to, maybe drop in importance in the algorithm, as we say, right? That you don't see certain kinds of content from certain kinds of publications as often because they're untrustworthy or they have a lot of history with mis and disinformation, which I understand was a session yesterday. So there's a lot of different interventions. But let me go back to the content moderation one, because that is something that we all think about a lot, is how do you identify pieces of content to be taken down? How does the platform, the sort of amorphous technology itself, identify these things? And I will say that it is not terribly good. It will, of course, always get better, just as our responses or inauthentic behavior automation will get better. It's a sort of cat and mouse game. But just to give you a bit of the state of play right now, if we imagine a lot of this being done with AI and algorithmic, data-driven methods, they require those kinds of models that are machine learning or machine trained. They require a lot of data to be able to be good, especially at situations where there's nuance involved. Say I'm a reporter and I'm reporting on something terrible that has happened versus I am, somebody who is involved in something that terrible has happened. And the nuance between just stating the facts versus inciting violence around it can be very thin and very hard for a computer to understand. Somebody mentioned the Christchurch call that was a result of that horrible shooting incident that was live streamed on Facebook. A lot of folks imagined that in the wake of that, now what must happen is Facebook live video needs to be able to detect when there's a live shooter running around and be able to take those videos down in real time. But, maybe positively, on the positive side, we don't actually have that many videos of live shooters running around shooting people. So it's very difficult to train an AI in computer vision to be able to identify something like that in real time. So there's a natural limit to some of this content. And I would just like to say too, that, of course, then when we're talking about volumes of data, there's not very much of it in languages other than English. And so when we're talking about the importance of the international human rights framework in other contexts, folks maybe remember one example is the Rohingya crisis. Part of the problem was that there was so few, right? This was not happening in English, so it was very, very difficult. So I would just say that while this feels like a lot of intractable technical problems, I think there are a lot of solutions, but I will just support what Pamela started out with, and I think also something that Mark was alluding to, which is that the solutions are not always technical, even if they are today happening very much online like the rest of our lives. We must go to first principles, and we must think of these as having a very, very long history, and they're not invented by the internet, but maybe we can use some of these techniques wisely to make that better. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Just quickly for the first question, you've talked about online harms to individuals, which I think is so important. I really like your framing about harms versus what kind of speech is permissible. But should we think about more broadly about societal harms, but really quickly so we stay on time?
Absolutely. I think because social media feels very individualistic, we go on by ourselves, we look at our timelines by ourselves, we reply. It's very isolating. This is why I think the international human rights legal framework is much better than just thinking about individual pieces of content, because it gives us also the ability to say, this is harmful on a much wider scale. because of the outcomes, because of the context in which it is. So I do think that a lot of the trust and safety conversation can kind of get a little bit too focused on our individual experiences. Like I have been harmed, but it isn't about me being harmed. It's actually about the scale of harm. And so I think it's sort of baked into what I was discussing.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Andre Obler, we've already heard from in the opening remarks this morning. He is the CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, an IEEE Tech Ethics Global Ambassador, chair of the IEEE Global Public Policy Committee, and a member of the Australian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. He previously served as co-chair of the Global Forum for Combating Antisemitism and on the advisory board for the Swedish government-run Malmo International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I've added some notes to what I wanted to say just to pull in some feedback from what our previous speakers have covered. I want to just start with Pam's discussion of blood libels. A year ago in this room, I actually spoke on the Missing Disinformation panel. And the entire talk I gave there was actually on blood libels as a form of mis and disinformation. And not only from those historic roots, which, Pam took us through so well, but the most recent, or, other than the printing press, etc., it also spread through artwork in churches. And that content, as I showed last year, is still spreading now through social media by people taking photographs of historic artwork in churches that is anti-Semitic, putting it onto social media, remixing it into videos and saying, look, these are authentic, hundreds of year old artifacts that show that this must be real because the artifact is authentic. Never mind the fact that the artifact was presenting misinformation or disinformation even when it was first carved or painted. The other thing I mentioned there was that the most recent artwork of a blood libel, at that point at least last year, was only a few years earlier in Italy, where someone produced a large painting which was a blood libel painting. Nowadays we've had even more because AI has been used to generate modern versions of the historic blood libel imagery. So this is very much a connection between the technology and the problems of the past. I also want to mention that there is a reason that there is a lot of discussion on anti-Semitism on this panel. And my remarks are, I'll touch on anti-Semitism again, but my work goes well beyond anti-Semitism. It covers all forms of online hate. And even so, we end up spending over half our time on anti-Semitism. And one reason is that anti-Semitism is a very large problem, but it's also, as a result of the Holocaust, been the driver for a lot of the development of international law in this space, for the creation of our concept of genocide, for the creation of a lot of the international human rights framework. There is still a very heavy investment in dealing with anti-Semitism from the Jewish community, also from governments and others, more so than there is focused on any other problem. So therefore, the generic problems of online hate tend to first appear in the context of anti-Semitism, and potential solutions tend to first appear in the context of solutions to anti-Semitism. So it is at the cutting edge. The remarks I want to make now really focus on whether AI can solve this problem. As I've mentioned in previous panels, our panelists have each come at this problem from a different perspective. My role on this panel is the AI one. And I want to start with a discussion of one example. It's a cartoonish image of Hitler with a speech bubble that says, I wish I could go back in time and try again. And I shared this with a number of experts from tech companies. And the thing that surprised them most was the fact that the AI did not detect this. And how does the AI detect it? Well, first, it needs to identify that the cartoon image is an image of Hitler. Nowadays, the AI is pretty good at doing facial recognition or photographs. The minute you turn the photograph into a cartoon or into a drawing of the person, it doesn't have the same features that can be measured in the same way that facial recognition can identify the person. Put the same image in front of an actual human and they can look at it and say, I know who that is. So if you can't identify the speaker, you're lost from the start because you have no context. Secondly, you've got the speech bubble. Okay, if we know it's Hitler, then we also need to know what is Hitler most infamous for. When he says, I want to go back in time and try again, what is he talking about? Now, again, a human looking at that knows what that means. They know that that is an anti-Semitic post that is talking about committing genocide against Jewish people, right? That is the most, applying Occam's razor, that is the simplest explanation of what that cartoon is saying. But you would need to first identify Hitler, then know what Hitler was, infamous for, and then give interpretation to those words. Because the words themselves, if the image had not been Hitler, could mean absolutely anything. So the AI doesn't have the same capacity as a human and likely never will. I want to start with that. Then I want to talk about generative AI. So generative AI can be used to create images of hate speech that the same generative AI cannot interpret to recognize what the image is saying. It's a one-way process. It's almost like our encryption algorithms that you apply stuff and it comes out the other end and it creates something. And the problem with that is that the words to create an image could create many, many different images. The image that's represented could mean many, many different things, right? Potentially based on context. Sometimes it can interpret it, but there need to be very specific clues in the image to do that. For example, Nazi swastikas. Okay, that would be a good symbol, but even then you could get false positives. That brings us to the point of human creativity. There are an infinite numbers of ways that an idea can be expressed. This makes addressing hate speech harder than addressing disinformation or misinformation, as we discussed yesterday. Misinformation or disinformation is a particular claim of fact that is either true or false. It's very specific. One form of hate speech that is harmful could be mis or disinformation. However, you could have many different forms of claims that are disinformation that represent the same hate speech idea. So there's much more variety, much more creativity that can go into the expression. It was mentioned yesterday that on the disinformation panel that AI is good at working with hard data. I would call that hard data the sorts of things that can be observed through sensors. Okay? I think Mikey spoke about, detecting the edges of environmental, for environmental degradation. Those are things that there is an answer to. It's far less good, as was said yesterday, when it comes to human-related content. I would argue that they're actually two very different problems. Okay, AI applied to things that we can sense and make decisions on versus AI that needs to interpret and understand human thinking are different problem spaces, and the one is much easier to solve than the other. When we use AI, we are not only training the machine, we're also training the human. So when we use, and yesterday, I don't know if anyone picked up on it, but on the extremism panel, I came and I had a quick word with Skip, the moderator, and I said, Skip, can you move from the podium over there and come and sit on the panel on the side over here? Anyone notice that? Do you know why that was? On the screen behind me, we have a video feed coming from an OWL device that's sitting on the table here, which is controlled by AI. It's splitting the screen, it's focusing on whoever's moving and speaking. we were missing the far left person on the panel because the AI was detecting Skip moving because he was standing over at the podium. By moving Skip to the side, it took a few seconds, but slowly the device zoomed out and refocused, and suddenly we had the whole panel again, right? We didn't change the AI, we changed the human. Okay, and when we're using all of the voice to text and other approaches, what we're actually doing is training the human how they can be clear to express themselves to the AI in a way that the AI will understand, how you can be deliberative in your instructions. That's great so long as the person actually wants the AI to do its job in relation to what they're saying. So going back to human creativity, what about the case where the person deliberately doesn't want the AI to understand them? That human creativity can then learn to express itself in ways that the AI has a lot more trouble with. So I want to move on now to talk a little bit about autonomy, human autonomy. And this goes a little bit to what Mallory was just talking about. AI is a tool. When it comes to restricting a basic human right, such as freedom of expression, we can't allow a significant level of false positives, right? Or we can't allow a significant number of false positives to be determined by a machine. We're much more tolerant of false positives when they come from actual people, okay? Particularly if there's then a right of appeal to other people, to, higher levels, more skilled people, to a panel of people to assess the judgment of an individual. Our tolerance for the machine is, I think, a lot lower. And we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at AI, because we need to determine what is an acceptable use of AI and what is a use of AI that may impinge more than is reasonably necessary on people. Yep. Okay. This is not really an AI one, but I just want to mention Facebook advertising. In order to prevent hate speech targeting individuals and being paid for, so paid boosts on posts, Facebook does not allow you to target particular groups based on ethnicity, religion, etc. Sounds like a great idea that it prevents targeting. It also prevents targeting of content to those groups by other members of those groups for community services and other things that provide benefits to those particular groups. Okay, so when we want to, for example, promote work we're doing tackling, let's say, Islamophobia, we can't easily promote those posts to be seen by people in the Muslim community to show what we're doing, because we're just not allowed to target them as a group for the advertising. Okay, yep, I'm wrapping up. So the final comments I'll make here, hold on. Okay, so can AI, is AI useless? Can we use AI? And I think AI can be used to find and address well-known expressions of hate and stop them from continuing to circulate, so well-defined examples. It can prioritize and queue things for human reviewers to look at, and it can prompt reviewers when they're looking at comments to consider whether it might be giving a particular message. So there is a use for it, but it needs to be part of a system that also involves humans. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. So in the interest of time, since I'm supposed to ask one question, I'm going to do something I've learned to do in Congress. I'm going to give you a yes or no question, and just yes or no. And should AI-based moderation be required in large social media platforms? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. For our final panelist, I am pleased to introduce Paul Giannasi, who is an OBE. You can look that up if you don't know what it is. He is the hate crime advisor to the National Police Chiefs Council in the United Kingdom. Following 30 years as a police officer, he advises on hate crime policy and coordinates national responses, managing the True Vision reporting site and the National Online Hate Crime Hub on behalf of the police. He is the co-author of the National Police Hate Crime Guidance, which offers advice to all UK police officers and partners. Welcome.
Thanks very much. First, if I could apologise for my attire. British Airways and Hertz managed to get me into DC at midnight last night. Unfortunately, my luggage is still in Europe. So I have hand-washed clothes dried over air conditioner, which unfortunately wasn't enough to get the coffee stain from the airplane movements out of my trousers. So I don't normally dress like this.
Can I just thank Paul for the extreme efforts he's gone to be with us today?
So if I could also say that these views will be mine rather than government sort of police policy that gets me out of trouble. And I'm going to make some pretty grand statements that I would be happy to kind of engage in conversations at lunchtime if people disagree. Everybody's got the right to disagree. But I'm going to make some pretty grand statements which I would normally want to justify, but for brevity obviously won't. I am, a police officer by career. I was seconded in to run the government's hate crime program, which is all hate crime, in 2007, and I as was just said, direct a very small team called the National Online Hate Crime Hub that offers the first response to internet offences, or many internet offences, and that the purpose of that, what it doesn't do is trawl. We don't set people off to go and find offenders. We only respond to complaints from members of the public, but we found that those complaints were being pretty poorly treated, and lots of them were duplicates, and lots of them were going to go nowhere because they weren't criminal. So we put in place a central team to kind of coordinate that. But I also chair a thing called the National Cohesion and Hate Crime Goal Group in the UK. And that's the kind of national group which has oversight of community tensions, and obviously hate speech, as I'll talk about, has got a significant role in that. First off, just in terms of there is a real sort of difference when we get into academic debate and public policy debate about the different stances of free speech versus control. And on one side, I will be called Orwellian, normally by people who've never read George Orwell and certainly haven't read The Road to Wigan Pier, which is kind of my steering in life. But I will be called Orwellian. I'll be called the thought police. And it's this narrative from the extremes and from the most vocal often of kind of arguing for the extremes. And the reality of it is, when we get down to talking with kind of law enforcement officers from the DOJ here, what we're actually doing in practical terms is much more closely aligned than some of the debate that takes place. But there is a difference of approach from the First Amendment here that obviously is a cornerstone of the conversations here, and the EU approach and the European approach. The EU requires its states to have legislation to criminalise the incitement of hatred on the grounds of race and religion. The European Court of Human Rights isn't really about controlling government, it's about controlling rights, including government, obviously, but it's about the balance of rights. So my right to free speech against Mark's right to life. If my free speech is espousing hatred to the point where Mark's life is threatened, the court is going to say that his right to life is slightly higher in importance than my right to free speech. So that kind of balance of rights is in the European approach, for me, is a kind of much more nuanced and balanced approach than purely the arguments. What I will also say is there is kind of similarities. So things like threatening to kill, bomb hoaxes, are speech offences. For me, the speech is the vehicle for the crime, and that's how I would kind of characterise so UK and European legislation. We don't criminalise the speech, with a few other exceptions. We criminalise the stirring up of hatred. We criminalise the incitement of harm. We criminalise the threats to kill. They're just delivered through speech, but so are bomb hoaxes, so are frauds, so are many other crimes. There is some exceptions to that, which I should just sort of add without giving much detail. Things like Holocaust denial in Germany and France and Austria, for instance, are obviously specific crimes linked to the specific circumstances of the history of those companies. So I got involved in 2007. The hate on the internet and hate speech on the internet was really characterized by sites like Stormfront on the internet. It was actually really hard to find them. The public weren't concerned about them because they didn't see them. The only people you had to work really hard to get in there to see the vile racist hostility that was there. And it wasn't being shared. The relevance of social media really changed the dynamic of of hate speech on the internet in particular. And suddenly that kind of freedom of anonymity, the freedom of not having to own the space that it's published, not having to get through an editor, but being able to post on somebody else's website anonymously, gave that kind of freedom to those who would espouse hate. And it massively changed the dynamics. So the role of one of our independent advisory group talks about as this mantra that hate speech is at the foothills of genocide, that you don't have one between the other. And we've been alluded to kind of Gordon Allport's kind of model of discrimination that for me describes it really well. So we have this kind of issue about not all hate speech will go on to either fuel or escalate to violence, but nobody will get to the violence without the hate speech. And Susan Bonesh's work looking at Twitter in the Kenyan elections in 2007 was really informative, to show how Twitter in that instance was used to lead to the circumstances or contribute to the circumstances that led to, I think, 3,500 people being killed in the violence. Facebook's role in the lead up to the genocide in Myanmar, for me, is indefensible. It's a kind of situation that was out of control and was one of the contributing factors, no doubt, to the violence that occurred there. So the kind of issue of the social media as opposed to the internet changed things massively. So we've had a goal group running in the UK in the wake of critical incidents since the tragic murder of Lee Rigby in 2013. And Lee Rigby was a soldier murdered in an Islamist terrorist attack in London. And what we realized is that the narrative that was taking place, the division that was occurring in society, pitching this soldier against the Muslims, was used to divide communities, used to escalate hostility in both directions. And it was really for me, it really struck home as to why we as the state need to be cognizant of the impact that the hostility is having on the communities that we seek to serve. So I think it's naive to argue, and Deborah's got the right to argue. For me, it's naive to argue that there is no role for the state in speech, that it's a free space and we shouldn't be there. I think it's utterly reckless for a state not to understand the impact that hate speech is having on its communities. I absolutely accept the argument and the discussion that says that it isn't about responding to it through legislation. We should respond through more speech, through education, through engagement, through self-regulation, through whatever route we choose. But if we're not understanding the impact it has on a society, we can't seek to protect the society. And the first role of democratic institutions and democratic governments, for me, is the protection of its people from harm. So we monitor hate speech as part of this goal group. So the goal group sits and it sits with kind of our key partners. It sits with law enforcement. It sits with government officials. It sits with civil society and our key partners from academia. And we gather around the table when critical incidents have caused tensions to escalate. And we monitor a whole series of sort of pieces of data to inform the decisions that we're going to make. So the process is we share information. Our sources of information would be hate crime data, which is probably the most comprehensive data, but takes us 2 or 3 weeks to get. We then have civil society and community intelligence data that comes in. And we also monitor at a macro level the internet and the amount of hate speech that's occurring on different sites and different subjects. So we monitor all that. The kind of purpose is we gather that information, we assess the threats to the community and to society. We agree an action plan to mitigate against that, which can be education, communication, enforcement, whatever we decide is the most appropriate. And then we come back together to monitor until the threat levels have gone back to normal. And what we've kind of understand from that, and what we've grown as an expertise as a body from that, is an ability to make better decisions about when to act and also importantly when not to act. So the way I would describe what we get is what's really important is you have to understand the sensibilities of those who have a propensity to racist violence. it's no use applying our standards, our moral lines to the information we have. We have to understand what makes tick those who would be angry but use violence, rather than those who would be angry but share it at a reasonable level of conversation. And this is really been brought home. We've mentioned a couple of times Christchurch in the video and the kind of the video posted by the perpetrator. Christchurch led to a 220% increase in anti-Muslim hate crime the week following. Now, the only role of Muslims, and that's in the UK, obviously, the only role of Muslims in Christchurch was as victims of an atrocity, of a racist and religious atrocity. Yet people turned to violence towards the Muslim community. So 220% increase was bigger than we saw after the Manchester Arena attack, which, for anybody who remembers, in 2017 was a horrific terrorist attack targeting young children leaving a pop concert in Manchester, one of the most kind of anger-inducing kind of terrorist attacks that we've suffered in the UK. Yet we saw more hostility fueled by empathy with the perpetrator in Christchurch, just about geographically as far away as you can get from the UK, than we did in anger at the perpetrators and that. So we have to understand that and kind of have that to fuel our decisions. My final bit of evidence for my recklessness allegation, to say that it's reckless not to do it, is a quote that came from the perpetrator of the racist atrocity in Buffalo 2 years ago, and kind of you'll be aware more than I of the details of that, but a racist atrocity from an ideological perpetrator who was fueled by empathy with other perpetrators. And I choose to take the Jacinda Ardern approach of not naming these people, but we all know who we're talking about. And he's got a quote which I'll sort of read to you, which he posted on his own sort of social media. He said, "Every time I think maybe I shouldn't commit an attack, I spend 5 minutes on 4chan, and then my motivation returns." He was, in the same way as a kind of our terrorist attack in Finsbury Park that targeted Muslims, in the same way as the assassination of Joe Cox, the MP, who was standing up for the rights of Syrian refugees, the perpetrators were fueled by empathy with fellow perpetrators. So for me, it becomes a kind of more evidence of the recklessness of this. And I absolutely accept it's not about kicking doors. It's not always about kicking doors in and taking computers off people. It might be about education. It might be about counter-narrative. There is a whole range of solutions to it. And I'll finally just talk about, if I may, because we haven't really kind of discussed it in length, is that we would normally run our goal group for about 4 to 6 weeks after a terrorist incident, for instance, and we would assess by the end of that normally that we are back to normal levels of hostility. So we're never going to be hostility free, but we're back to normal level. October the 7th has broken society in the UK, and I suspect it's the same in most communities. The fractures that have occurred both between but also within communities are so significant that 12 months later we are still holding fortnightly meetings to discuss the level of hostility. So early indicators that in London, the Metropolitan Police recorded a 1,280% increase in anti-Semitism in the first month, a 280% increase in anti-Muslim hate crime, which we know is massively underreported because there is a sense of bias from many pro-Palestinian, pro-Muslim communities. There is a perceived bias in their eyes about the police and the state response. So we know that underreporting is greater, but we know that significant violent conflict is violent incident is taking place because of the macro level of narrative. And for that to be going after 12 months is unprecedented for anything that we've ever experienced. So we're on new territory with that. So sorry if that was a rip through.
And that was startling when you say normally that you're only meeting a few weeks after one of these massive.
The attention span of the far right is about 4 or 5 days. They move on. And this is very different.
So we are. There was such a rich panel, and for those of you in the room, the panel is is keeping you from getting your coffee. So I've been given permission to go about 5 minutes over. But before I take questions, either from the panelists or from the room, are there questions online? I don't know who was moderating the online question. No questions. All right. So I think it would be fair to open it to the group, because we'll be able to have conversations.
Actually, there is a question.
There's one. Okay.
Can you
Yeah.
grab mic?
Okay, from Karen Phillips, the relationship between hate speech and harm seems to be much closer offline than online. Does the anonymity of the online space increase harm? Should this be changed?
You know what? Maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll let everybody have a quick response. Natalie?
So I have, there was so much discussed here that I have a few comments and a question as well. So first of all,
Can we
regarding,
update questions because of time? And then
I'll
we'll-
be very quick.
Okay.
Regarding the last point, I feel about October 7th, I obviously didn't live through the Dreyfus affair, but I have the feeling, hey, this is just like the Dreyfus affair. Everybody's divided and all this. This is a quick comment. The main comments go to the people to the left of Pam, about, as you can guess, about AI. I am an AI researcher. I've been an AI researcher for 35 years. And I am a bit different from others because I have been very critical of AI, thinking, no, it will never happen. It's really interesting, but we will never be able to see things. But I must say that in the past few years, I have been very surprised by what AI can do. So to take Andre's comments, sure, if we're talking about supervised learning, if we're talking about classification, that won't work. We don't have enough data. I think Mallory said that too. But there are things that AI can do. The idea of the caricature, for example, I am pretty sure that that could be recognizable because generative AI actually goes both ways. You can generate and then it is, the technology is such that it goes in both directions. So my guess is that that could be done. And my question really, I'm getting to my question, I'm sorry, is if we move away from supervised learning and go into unsupervised learning, into one-class learning, for example, modeling the normal and rejecting the abnormal, something I've done in the cybersecurity domain for years, is there no hope that AI can help? Not alone, I agree. It will be together with the human, but is there no chance that if we take those more sensitive type of AI techniques, we have a chance to make it help? So maybe this is for Mallory or Andre.
I think I saw another question. Did I see another question in the room? Yeah. And please make it a question and brief because I want to give everybody a minute to respond.
There was an article that came on health and technology by Julie Powells from the UK, where she discussed the DeepMind agreement with the National Health System. And what she was arguing was not so much what the agreement said, but what the Google DeepMind Association were collecting data and what that could cause in the future. So the question is, from a privacy perspective, there's a lot of information regarding religious background, all sorts of information from economics to religion, culture.
And the question?
That can impact hate speech if it gets into the wrong hands. And as the whole world is getting digitally transformed, we have more and more information that goes to different companies that have all that information. How do we protect the public?
Okay, excellent. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give everybody on the panel 1 minute to either respond to the questions or something else you wanted to say to one of the panelists. We're going to start with Mallory.
Thanks. Yeah, these questions are really provocative. We can't get into all of them, but I think a really important takeaway is that I also have a lot of skepticism about AI's abilities, but it's because that I have hope that it can help, that I think it's very important to understand its limitations. And new techniques, the frontier of research is certainly going to help. But I just want to highlight this tension. AI is just data-driven software. It's data-driven methods. And I think you're really right to point out there will always be this inherent tension with our privacy rights and the things that we don't necessarily want in the hands of the state, and then the ability to train computers on massive piles of public data or private data that's been scooped up without necessarily consent. So we need to be very careful about expanding these techniques while also preserving privacy.
Excellent. Andre.
Okay. To Natalie's question, the challenge is that sort of image that I described, it would be very possible to have another image that represented somebody else or a generic cartoon figure that was not Hitler, that a person, I think, could detect as being probably not, but the AI would not be able to, with confidence, differentiate between those two. So that's the risk. It's the fact that we need to have such a high degree of confidence in the AI's decision. It's not good enough if it's right 90% of the time or even 99% of the time. So that's, and if I can just comment on Paul's, you spoke about the sustained rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. My organization's been monitoring online anti-Semitism consistently now for 2 years, and we did an intensive monitoring, and I'll present later today, on the Islamophobia work over 3 months after October 7. What we've seen on the anti-Semitism since the end of that project up until monitoring that finished just a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, it had risen to about 800% above normal. It dropped to about 500% in the last month since February to the end of September. The drop largely came from those far-right platforms, exactly like you say. The mainstream platforms, the drop was much smaller. And in fact, one platform, Instagram, has actually gone up further. It's got more anti-Semitic content than it had even after the attack.
Okay. So, Mark.
I'm not going to address the technological issues that were put up, but I will respond to something that Natalie said about the Dreyfus affair, which I have to say that I think October 7th is much greater in its reach than the Dreyfus affair ever was. Dreyfus was sort of localized to a certain extent to France, and there were manifestations other places, Austria and Italy, and far right traditionalist Catholic circles. It still has a certain resonance and so on. But we have seen nothing like the international aspects of the post-October 7th reaction in both the mob scenes that I described earlier, the physical violence targeting Jews around the world, as well as the acceptance of anti-Semitism in elite circles, in academic circles, in media circles, and so in political circles. This is all unprecedented, and I think it was far beyond the reaction to the Dreyfus incidents.
Paul, you get the closing remarks.
Thanks. If I may go back to the online question, which if I understand it right, was about the comparison between online and offline hate as to which was most relevant. And for me, I think it's almost interchangeable. The reality of it is one feeds off the other. So somebody with 30 million or 50 million followers using drip, drip, drip demonization of a community is going to have more impact than a rabid neo-Nazi with 32 followers on Twitter. It is clearly kind of measuring harm rather than measuring veracity that's important. And there was an example from London where somebody tried to demonize the mayor of London, who's a Muslim, started talking about the kind of Londonistan was the sort of term that was used to kind of say that London has been taken over by Muslims, which is bizarre but untrue. And the reality of it is people kind of amplified that on social media from traditional journalism, and then it was picked up by political figures and amplified many thousands and thousands of times over. So the reality of it is they're interchangeable. The online is a much better tool for getting it into the weeds and into the kind of corners of society than the mainstream is. But online will use the same tropes that come from online, from offline material. So for me, I think it's almost kind of impossible to separate them out, and I would suggest that they feed off each other.
Thank you. Would you please join me in thanking this terrific panel?